I was in prison for 9/11, and I'll never forget it. I'm certain that if you're watching this, wherever you were and whatever you were doing, you'll never forget 9/11 either. We all have that place that we were in that moment in time where we heard the news of 9/11, and we all remember how it made us feel, whether it was shock, disbelief, confusion, fear, anger. There was a range of emotions that were flying around everywhere during 9/11. And for me, I was in prison and I was a kitchen clerk, and I will never forget the first person who told it to me was this dude, little white dude from Baton Rouge who had gold teeth. His name was Kevin. If you ever see this, Kevin, man, hit me up. But he was washing pots and pans, and we had already served breakfast. Chow had already been served, and I'm sitting in most of the kitchen's cleaned out. People are sweeping. We going in that relaxed mode before we start getting ready for lunch. People kind of take a break, have cigarette breaks. People in the front sipping coffee, kind of just getting their thoughts together, because in the kitchen you get some solitude because it's not on the yard, it's not in the dorms. And during that time in between chows, it's usually one or two officers, and that's it. And just the people who, the few do, because the entire kitchen staff of inmates aren't in the kitchen once all the rush is done. In other words, once the food's been served and everything's clean, you only keep a handful of people in the kitchen to continue pots and pans, to, continue to cook, to bake, and the cook might stay in there because they got their things going, in the kitchen clerk. That's pretty much it. Maybe a couple other dudes cleaning. And so my boy Kevin was on pots and pans, and I remember he comes back there and he's smiling. He got those gold too. Like in the South, there's a lot of white people who have gold teeth. That's not uncommon in this deep South. So he comes up to me, he's smiling, got those gold teeth just blinging in my face, and he's like, "Huh, bruh?" And I said, "What happened, man?" You could see something. He's like, "Man, it's funny, bro. That plane just hit the building." Now, he said it was funny because he was listening to headphones. He was listening to the local radio station, and they said a plane had hit the building. He was assuming a crop duster had hit the World Trade Center buildings. And so he's like, "Man, they flying in planes, man. They dusting them crops, man. They don't know what they doing. They ran into that building." I said, "Really?" And so I didn't think nothing of it. I said, "Huh?" And so we just talked, and he went on. But I'll never forget, because after that, the kitchen supervisor, who is a free person, who works out, he's not a police officer, but he's over the kitchen. He has a police officer uniform on, but he wasn't a guard. He just was over the kitchen. His name was Mr. Black, an old dude. He was probably in his 70s at this time, and he comes walking there. He used to call me Chasson. He said, "Chasson," because that's my last name. He said, "What you know about these buildings?" And now, for me, to make you understand, the reason he asked that is I've always been into conspiracies, and I've always been into reading into things a little bit more than the average person. And I was always talking about that type of stuff, conspiracies. So at this time, I'm like, why would you say that? He's like, "Man, there's an attack on the nation. They just ran a plane into the building." And I said, "Really?" By that time, everybody's putting everything on. People are, coming off coming from the dorms, and they coming into the thing. Now everybody's starting to talk about it. And I remember, I'll never forget, he said, "Who you think did this, Chesson?" And I promise you, I ain't making this up, y'all. You don't have to believe me. You can say I'm lying, whatever. I'm just telling you what happened. I'll never forget. I said, "It was probably bin Laden." He said, "Yeah?" He said, "Who's that?" I said, "I'm reading about him, man," because I had just read an article literally that week about bin Laden in the Time magazine, or one of those magazines, and it was about the USS Cole. And I had read it, and I remember reading a couple articles about him because, I get interested in this stuff, and so I'm reading about bin Laden. And I said, it might have been bin Laden. Sure enough, the name bin Laden's plastered everywhere immediately after. And I'm looking like, I'm Nostradamus or somebody. Listen, I ain't nobody special. I just happened to be reading Time magazine at the time, and they did an article on bin Laden and the USS Cole and the bombing of the embassy in Africa. And I remember reading it. It was fresh in my mind, and that's why I tossed the dude's name out there. It wasn't that I knew for a fact. It was more happenstance that I just guessed right. So in the prison, things are crazy. People are calling home. The phone lines at the time were off the hook. I'll never forget, because my brother, I found this out later, my brother, who was living in Virginia at the time, he was actually on a plane that same day that he was on a plane on 9/11, but he was on a plane from New Orleans back to Virginia. So he was in the air as well when this was happening. And I never forget talking to my mom, and she was so grateful. She said, "I'm so happy your brother's okay. I'm so happy your brother's okay." And that's when I found out he was flying back home from New Orleans to Virginia. But there's one thing I remember about being in prison, you know what I mean, is that no matter who you were, even the prisoners and the convicts were united during that day, in those days. I remember white dudes, black dudes, Spanish dudes, Vietnamese dudes. Everybody felt the same way. Like, man, this stings. This hurts. And everybody was patriotic. Everybody appreciated America. And so looking at things today now, looking back at 9/11, it's not a time to complain about the people who hate America, but it's a time to remember the people who love America. And I say, God bless America. And I'm grateful to be an American. And I'm thankful for all the wonderful men and women who served this great nation, as soldiers for America. And I'm grateful for all the men and women, police officers, firefighters, you know what I mean? Everybody, the male people, the teachers, you know what I mean? My grandfather was worked for the post office, so I'm grateful for everybody who works in America and does things to support this nation, the hardworking men who work in the oil field. I'm grateful to all the people that help make America run on a day-to-day basis. And specifically the oil field, I say that because I spent a lot of time in the oil field. And I'm grateful to be an American. And I just wanted to share this post and tell you where I was and what I was doing and how I remember 9/11 from being in prison. And here I am free now all these years later. And I still occasionally go back and watch clips of 9/11, and there's still people telling their stories of 9/11. And we remember all the thousands of victims who lost their lives on 9/11. And this is a crime and prison related channel. And you have to think that some of the co-conspirators who helped carry out 9/11 are still incarcerated at the ADX Colorado Supermax prison, right? So they're in there with people like the drug cartel members, Unabombers, and, key members to shot callers from prison gangs. That's in people like that. And I think the FBI informants and all that who got arrested, or spies, they're all in ADX Supermax prison in Colorado. And that's where they still are. So we still have people who were connected to that. I'm sure there's people who didn't get caught, but I know the U.S. military did a number on all the conspirators who were involved with 9/11. So a lot of them people have been unalived. But in the vacuum of things, new evils have arisen. And so make no mistake, there's a lot of people who hate us and hate freedom. There are people who live in this nation who hate freedom. And it's sad. I pray and wish they would turn around, man, and see how great you got it. You spend your whole life complaining how terrible things is, and you don't take time to smell the roses, and you miss out on life. And it wasn't so bad, but you bought into the hype. You were brainwashed and fooled. Anyway, man, give me a like and subscribe to the Pen and the Shank. Let's get it.